Hi everyone, welcome to Guts and Girl Bits. I'm so excited to have you listening to this episode today. I'm talking with a naturopath who is just so inspiring. She's incredibly knowledgeable and passionate about the topic that we're going to be talking about today. And she's just all around a really lovely person. You might notice that there's a little bit of editing that I had to do to this podcast, and the reason was because I had Lara with me while I was recording, but she was not a happy chappy, and sometimes she was screaming, and so I had to do a bit of editing and just re-record some of my sections because you just couldn't even hear what I was saying because Lara was screaming over the top of me. But my guest for today was just so gracious and patient and understanding, which I'm so grateful for. So my guest is the amazing Tabitha McIntosh. Now, if you are a fellow practitioner or if you're in the industry, then you're probably about as excited as I am right now because Tabitha is just so brilliant at what she does. And I'm just very grateful to have her on the show. This is a topic that I've been wanting to talk about for a long time, and it's something that many people don't really know that much about, or they might know a little bit, but they don't know the extent that it's actually affecting people. What we're going to be talking about is how chemicals in our environment are impacting on our hormones, particularly hormones as women, but also affecting our fertility and the health of our offspring and the health of our grandchildren, because these chemicals can actually pass through on a multi-generational level, which is really scary. So Tabitha and I talk about that in the podcast, and we talk about where you can look out for these sorts of chemicals and what you can do to reduce your exposure. We talk about some of the things that we're seeing in the literature coming up that Tabitha has been able to find, because she has done so much research on this topic. She is so thorough in what she can find and what she can pull up, and the incidence of these defects in babies is so sad, because we know that if we had been able to have this awareness of the importance of avoiding chemicals there in the first place, then it wouldn't have possibly happened. So what I'm really hoping is that for everyone that's listening, you can take this information and become empowered, make changes. Even if it's just a little bit of a change, you're going to be reducing the burden of chemicals on yourself. Now, just before I get any further, I would just want to address the common thought that many people have in that, chemicals, everything is a chemical, all of these are around us. Chemical is a term that we are using as a bit of a descriptor to refer to something called an endocrine disrupting chemical. So it's a substance that's actually interfering with your hormones and with your DNA. Yep, so it's something that we do know is a real thing, and it's a scary thing, and we want to increase awareness. So I really hope everyone enjoys this podcast today. Thank you so much in advance for listening. Enjoy. Hi, Tabitha. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Alison, it's a pleasure.
So I'm so excited to have you here to talk about all of the things to do with reducing chemicals in our life and the impact that it makes on us. So I know that, for instance, your book, One Bite at a Time, and your e-course, Liquid Chemicals, it's all about the ways in which you can reduce our exposure to harmful chemicals or toxins in our environment. And so you put a huge amount of work into creating these resources, something which I'm very grateful for. But many people don't really appreciate the impact that toxins are having on their health or on their children or even on their grandchildren. Would you be able to explain the impact that the toxin exposure many people are exposed to is having?
Absolutely. And I really hear you there, Alison, that it's quite often overlooked. We tend to have to work with this sort of consumer myth that if something's available on the shelf, at Woolies or wherever we might be shopping, for a personal care product, or whether it be a vegetable or a herb, that it must be safe for us because someone's sort of taking care of our own health interests and the interests of our infants and unborn children over their bottom dollar. But this is something that I have to, without it all being fearful, I have to manage and undo a lot in clinical practice, even when we train, as you would be full aware, with our nutrition and herbal medicine. There's not a huge amount of attention given to environmental medicine, but I think after a solid 15 or 16 years in clinical practice now, or probably 10 years in, to be honest, 6 or 7 years ago, it started to dawn on me that there was more to the picture. We weren't just our genetics, and certainly we could have an impact on the expression of our genes via nutrition, but there were a couple of other big players. So I like to talk about it as almost a triad or a triangle of a lens that I look at every single client that walks through my clinic door through this lens. So we've got their inherited tendencies via their genetics. Then we've got how we can manipulate those or keep particular genes switched on and off via nutritional biochemistry. And the third apex of the triangle really is our environment, whether we be discussing here our active stress management or our exposures to pesticides at certain stages of development, or air pollution having an impact on our expression of things like asthma or atopic conditions and other, a whole host of other endocrine disrupting chemicals that we might be exposed to on a day-to-day basis, totally unbeknownst to us, because we've got this sense of confidence that anything available on the shelf is going to be safe. So look, it was a great deal of work preparing the One Bite at a Time book with my co-author, Sarah Lance. We both put an enormous amount of effort into this manuscript, and we wanted to make sure it was thorough and comprehensive, but also entertaining, and obviously reference to the literature. And it became quite a behemoth. It's a very big read. However, it is lighthearted, and you can pick it up and put it down at any point. But we really felt that there was a lack of knowledge in the in our industries, in our professions, but also with the public in understanding the sorts of impacts that these chemicals could be having on all of the health presentations and health complaints that we see daily in clinic.
Yeah, it's such a tricky minefield to talk to some people about, because it's almost like when you do start to broach that concept, it's putting fear out there, and it raises the question of who you can trust, what can I trust, what are people hiding from me? And yes, in regards to yours and Sarah's book, it's absolutely beautiful. I wish I could give it to everyone, and it's beautiful just to look at as well. And the paper is beautiful, and you used recycled paper, didn't you?
Just from a sustainability perspective, it was really important to us to have that extra expenditure to honour what we were writing about, really.
Yes, that's so beautiful. It seems to be a bit of a hidden issue that there is a growing number of defects in babies that are preventable with the correct nutrition or by avoiding the chemicals which can cause this.
Well, the first defect I can talk to is Hypospadias. And for those of you that might not be familiar with what that is, Hypospadias is a condition where a baby boy is born with the opening of his urethra presenting somewhere along the shaft of his penis instead of at the tip of the penis. And that is a very scary thought. Obviously, it is picked up at birth, and it can be easily corrected by surgery. But this is one of those presentations that, affects, in Australian babies, affects maybe 1 in every 220 or 230 live male births. And there are some reports of it in parts of WA actually impacting 1 in every 150 live male births. But wherever we draw the statistics from, the Australian statistics from, there is consensus that there's been a significant increase in the presentation of this birth defect in baby boys. And when we think through, we don't have an exact answer as to why, but when we think through the fact that the testes and that the penile structure are quite significantly formed by about 14 weeks gestation. If that mum is unbeknownst to her, bathing herself in endocrine disrupting chemicals or androgen blocking chemicals, or further to that, some plastics chemicals which are estrogen mimicking, then that has enormous potential to derail some of that structural development that's occurring at the cusp of the first and second trimester of pregnancy. So hypospadias is one such defect that we've seen significantly increase incidence of over the last, say, 3 to 4 decades. But there are some other conditions too that we can't really call, defects, just things like asthma. Asthma in kids, we've seen significant increases of, whether some proportion of that be increases in diagnostics, but certainly we know that when fragrances are in the air at home, or if there's a great deal of particulate, or if someone is living in a more industrialised area near a main road, and also if someone is living in a damp or mouldy home, that they have a significantly increased risk of being diagnosed with an upper respiratory atopic condition such as asthma. And, when we ask in census data how much time as Australians we feel like we spend indoors, roughly 66% of our time we feel like we spend indoors. But reality is, and the World Health Organization is quoted as saying, that we spend more like 90% of our daily time indoors when we look at things like commuting and communal areas, community areas like shopping centres or daycares or schools, and certainly for the time that we're asleep at home. So when we spend such a significant proportion of our time indoors, it's really critical that we start looking at what, amounts of dust and how we're removing that dust, and, what sort of fragrances we're using, and perfumed products and cleaning gear we're investing in and bringing through the front doors at home, because all of these things can also trigger asthma.
Yes, thank you for that. So there's so many things that we do need to be considerate of while we're during that preconception phase, but also just in our day-to-day life as well. Are these chemicals also affecting a couple's ability to conceive?
Yes, so the way that I like to think about it, and this very much reflects the body of literature as well, is that the sperm are the smallest cell of the entire human body. And that's very, very significant, because what that means is that they tend to be the most vulnerable cell to environmental exposures, whether those exposures be EMF or plastics, chemicals, or, toxins of choice like alcohol and caffeine, or radiation from working in radiology departments, etc. So I know that there was a really large meta-analysis published just a couple of years ago showing that in Western men there's been a reduction in sperm counts and sperm concentration by over 50% over the last 4 decades, over the last 40 years. And the author, Professor Levine, of this study, of this meta-analysis or pooling of data, basically said that male reproductive markers can be used as markers of environmental exposures. And so, yes, in my clinical practice, not only am I seeing more than ever the benefits of a preconception program, I'm absolutely seeing increasingly compromised semen analyses reports, and to have that perspective of, say, 14 or 15 years of looking at these reports, even in my short career of 15 years, I've seen significant changes to sperm counts and concentrations, and also worsenings to things like DNA fragmentation, so higher amounts of DNA damage in the sperm, just as a result of, there are so many ways that these chemicals can cause damage. So they don't just mimic some endogenous hormones or block receptors of hormones. They can also compromise the mitochondrial health of cells, including the cells of the eggs and of the sperm, the DNA in there. So, the answer in a nutshell is yes. I would say reproduction is one of those areas that we cannot tease separate or tease apart from environmental medicine.
I think that's like a really interesting point about how it is that's something that affects the sperm so greatly, being that there's such a small unit. I think like the ratio of a sperm to an oocyte is actually very dramatically different, isn't it? It's something like a pinhead compared to a marble.
That's right. So, and also in one ejaculate, we can be looking at 200 million sperm as quite a reasonably average, sperm count. But
they can be quite delicate.
Oh, they're really delicate and very, very vulnerable. But the great thing about that is that they tend to respond to changes in diet or improvements in diet and specific antioxidants really, really beautifully. So not only are they very vulnerable, but considering they swim in the semen, the sperm cells swim in the semen, really semen just being a byproduct of that gentleman's lifestyle and nutrition, the more antioxidant factors that are in there and the less environmental contaminants that are in his semen that the sperm are bathing in, the better outcomes he has from a fertility perspective. But when we look at the ANZARD data, the data gathered by all of the Australian, New Zealand IVF clinics, we know that there are 4 major groups of infertility that present for IVF or IUI in Australasia, for example. And this is something that I think is really important to discuss, because we often think of infertility or subfertility as a female issue. But what we know based on this ANZARD data from 2016 is that 33% of people presenting for IVF are presenting 33% of couples presenting to IVF are presenting because of a female-only infertility factor. And 27.7% of those couples presenting for IVF help are presenting for a male-only infertility factor. About 15% of couples present because of combined male and female factors. But the 4th major group presenting for help is this: about 22% of couples are presenting for this unexplained infertility. And when we compare this 2016 data to data from 20 years ago, the major change seen over the last 20 years has been a doubling in the proportion of the unexplained fertility. And I don't think it's unreasonable to consider, and it's actually quite plausible, to consider the role of the environment in this, in both male factor infertility and in unexplained infertility.
Yes, definitely. I think it's something that might even get overlooked by some of the other health professionals that are in IVF as well, possibly. Do you think that there's a growing awareness, though?
I do believe there's a growing awareness and a growing regard for this concept of collaboration. So environmental medicine isn't customarily taught in medicine at university, and nor is it customarily taught in naturopathic medicine or clinical nutritional medicine. And that's really another major point I wanted to make. So it's nobody's fault really, but it does take that very critical thinker, that person that says why, and who tends to be gathering their own data, thinking outside the square to really take this on board. But it's not just that, really. We've seen a huge pouring out of published data looking at PubMed on environmental factors and male fertility or female fertility over the last, say, 2 decades. It's not just plausible anymore. We've got some really, really good data showing how significant the impact is of these chemicals on fertility.
For sure. And it's interesting what you were saying as well in regards to the sperm data, that how that's changing, because the reference ranges are changing as well, aren't they?
Well, that's exactly right. So when we look at the World Health Organization's reference values within semen analyses, 2 times ago that the reference values were set were 1999, and then they were reset, or the reference values and parameters were changed again or published again by the WHO in 2010. And just in that 11-year span, things like the healthy reference range for volume went from 2 mils to 1.5. A normal concentration for natural conception went from 20 million sperm per mil to 15 million sperm per mil, and the percent of normal forms that were considered normal and acceptable in 1999 were that 14% of sperm morphology looked normal, and in 2010, when those reference values were reissued, the percent of normal forms considered okay for natural conception went down to 4% from 14%. So it's a very, very big decline. That's right.
Oh my goodness. Okay, so what are some of the sources of toxins that we need to be avoiding?
Well, I would say the number one thing is, well, there's no real number one thing. I was going to talk about our food, because food is something that we tend to do, 3 times a day, sometimes more. And I don't just mean, are we buying seasonal local produce, hopefully free from pesticides, certified organic where possible, particularly when we look at the Environmental Working Group's Dirty Dozen list. That's my priority for my organic dollar. Mm-hmm. But certainly also food packaging. I really feel strongly that when we lose our skills in the kitchen, and we therefore become quite reliant and dependent on industrialised food systems and, canned food and packaged foods and food delivery and takeaway and things like that, that we're having a very big impact, not just on nutrient delivery, but also on the sorts of things that we are ingesting from food packaging. So whether it be the BPA, bisphenol A, epoxy resin lining of canned food, or leaching of food container packaging chemicals into our food when we reheat, or whether we be, stir frying or cooking on Teflon, non-stick surfaces. I really do think that in the kitchen is a very, very good place to start, using steel containers for food, or freezing batch soups or batch bologneses in glass Pyrex dishes, using things like steel water bottles rather than aluminium, and certainly rather than plastic. I don't think there is such a thing as safe plastics, really. So everything in our house is either glass or certainly steel, because it's easier to carry, using really nice brand steel thermoses to be able to take some hot food off to work for yourself, or in the lunchbox for kids, or to daycare, etc. So the kitchen is one of those places that we can start. And then I guess the cleaning, the pantry, the cleaning cupboard and the personal care products that we choose is a very close second, because how we're going to be exposed to these chemicals, whether they be pesticides, food packaging chemicals, fragrances, phthalates, endocrine disrupting chemicals, really we're either going to ingest them, we're going to breathe them in, or we're going to be putting them on our body. So certainly one by one, switching out your personal care product range, whether it be the soap that you're using, or your shampoos, conditioners, your moisturising creams, your deodorants. Great place to start a good switch out. And then definitely with the cleaning products. And something that people often overlook, if they're fortunate enough to have a cleaner coming in once a fortnight or once a week, that's quite significant bang for your buck to have your own cleaning products at home. Probably one of my favourite ranges of cleaning products. I don't know if I'm allowed to talk about it, brands, but I love the Abode range. The Abode range by Nicole Bilsma, a building biologist. She's formulated this range to be not only extremely effective, but absolutely naturopathic approved and clean, free from all synthetic fragrance and preservatives and anything that would irritate the airways on inhaling. So I know that I do a big stock up of whether it be glass cleaner or stainless steel cleaner or floor cleaner, toilet cleaner, and the personal care product range, detergent for the dishwasher, for my clothes, by the Abode range by Nicole Bilsma.
I've heard of that range, but I never connected that was by Nicole. Yeah. So that's so cool. There's actually so many wonderful brands coming out now with some basically safe options, but we still have to be a little bit savvy when we're reading the ingredients, don't we? Because often it'll be greenwashed, it'll be marketed as being safe. So there's certainly steps that we need to take to be careful with that.
Yeah, well, you shouldn't have to feel like you need a degree in, biochemistry just to read a label. As a general rule of thumb, the less ingredients, the better. And the more ingredients that you recognise, or, for example, that your grandmother would have recognised also in her pantry or in her cleaning arsenal, the better. And there are also some really fabulous resources for DIYs. You can make your own deodorants and toothpastes and, really wonderful cleaning products at home.
I think it can be so easy to do, but the whole concept of it is incredibly daunting. So for people who have just basically discovered that, oh my gosh, this is something that I need to do, like it can be very overwhelming. So buying products like that is a good place to start. And then in the meantime, they can, I guess, gradually transition into making some themselves.
Absolutely.
Like that.
Oh, and don't get me wrong, it's not about perfection. It's just about those small little changes that we can make. Once you run out of one particular cleaning product, swapping it out for something from the health food store or the natural aisle at the supermarket can be really useful. I certainly don't do a great deal of DIY just from being time poor with all of the long consulting hours. But, for those people who do have access to bulk, fresh lemon juice and bicarb soda and vinegars, a little bit of those sorts of ingredients can go a very, very long way. And I've got some ideas and recipes for those things in my Be Your Own Solution ebook, which is really a follow-on from the One Bite at a Time book that I co-authored with Dr. Sarah Lands. What I did as an outcome of that book, because we never made that book One Bite at a Time available internationally or as an ebook, but what I did a couple of years after publishing that book is took the solutions section and really turned it into an accessible ebook that's downloadable from my website. I think it's just $22, and obviously once downloaded can be on all of your devices. A great read for a domestic flight or something like that. But I talk about some of the ingredients you can use in DIYs or brands that you can purchase quite cost effectively in that ebook.
Amazing. Oh, well, we'll definitely link to that. Say a couple has just learnt all of this information. Do you recommend a certain time period for people who are trying to conceive? And how long does it take for these chemicals to be eliminated?
That's a really good question, Alison. And look, I guess the first thing I have to say is every couple's different. Right? So absolutely environmental medicine is a topic that's relevant to both partners of the baby-making couple, and certainly particularly when I'm working with a mature couple, I'm never really wanting to extend or delay their time to try to conceive significantly, because I understand how I could potentially compromise them there. But ultimately, in a very standard, couple just trying to do the best that they can, I would always be advocating for a 3 or 4 month window where we don't just work to maximise their nutrient status. So we have to sort of make sure that the thyroid is of both couples, but particularly the female, is getting adequate iodine, so it's really ready to make abundant thyroid hormone for the baby in that first trimester as well as mum. And I'm also working to make sure iron stores are replete, and vitamin D levels are good for, successful implantation. So it's not just about maximising nutrient stores and abundance of good phytochemicals to protect DNA. It is also for both partners about reducing chemical load, and some of these fat-soluble chemicals that tend to sort of end up in the more steady places of our body, like our adipose tissue, potentially even our brain, and some of the heavy metals like lead that can get into the bones. These can take months and months of a really, moderate effort detox to clear from the body. But for the most part, things like our organophosphate pesticides, they really do have a half-life in our body measured in hours, between 8 and 16 hours, depending on each chemical and all of those unique factors of each person, how well they've inherited particular detox enzymes, etc. So when we work for a period of, 12 weeks up to 16 weeks, even up to 20 weeks for both genders, we really are having a very significant impact on the quality of the DNA that couple, both of them, are offering their next generation by reducing mum's body burden and also by reducing dad's body burden and maximising his nutrient delivery. We're having a very big impact on the quality, sometimes also the morphology and the motility and even his sperm count. So 3 to 4 months is ideal in a perfect world, and that's what I work towards all the time. Some people I go longer, and some people, obviously, I have to expedite that.
Yeah, so good to understand that, and obviously everyone is so different. Depends on their case, depends on what they're exposed to.
It sure does. And, really, again, every case is different. To your point there, even the home environment, there's a great deal that we can do to transition the health of the home as well. So whether that couple decides to put on a water filter or, make sure there's no mold problems, the work is really endless.
Sure, for sure. And I know in your book that you co-authored with Dr. Sarah Lance, there's a section which you refer to as the pillars, and that provides a really good guide on how to reduce your chemical exposure and your lifestyle step by step. And I would love for you to share some of those with me. One of the things that I've found really interesting is how you can improve the air quality and why is that important?
Yeah, sure. When we think about just back to 101, the basics, in terms of our chemical exposures, we're either going to breathe them in, we're going to consume them, eat them on our food as, pesticide or food packaging, or we're going to put them on our body or touch them in some way or another. They'll go through our skin. And when it comes to our home, I believe that most Australian adults think that we spend about 2/3 of our time indoors, whereas the World Health Organization suggests we spend more like 90% of our time indoors. And a huge proportion of that time indoors is really in the bedroom. So air quality is critical because, first of all, what is air quality? We want the air to be moving. We don't want it to be too stagnant. So absolutely having the windows swung open and making sure that there's really good circulation is very, very important for air quality. And if that's really tricky to do because of the nature of the building, or it's a high-rise apartment, or you're living on a really main road, certainly it is possible to buy an air filter that includes a HEPA filter, just to be filtering any volatile organic carbons or fragrance smells and even dust out of the air to purify it for us. Nicole Bilsma, who writes Healthy Homes, she always says buy a filter or be the filter, and that is absolutely the case with air. But we certainly wouldn't want to have a great deal of damp problem or mould in a bedroom or in a bedroom cupboard, because those exotoxins that we can be breathing in can be very, very serious respiratory irritants, not just upset the eyes, but especially the sinuses and the nasal cavity and the entire respiratory system. And just for example, we can get more upper respiratory tract infections and more asthma when there's a big mould problem at home, and that can sometimes require intervention, things like antibiotics, which we want to be using really, really minimally. But I always advocate for plants in the house that we can have in the bedroom that can filter the air for us. And air quality is just sort of 101 to have a really nice peace lily or a mother-in-law's tongue or some sort of confirmed air quality improving plant in each room. It can have a really big difference. So can vacuuming with a really good quality filter, a HEPA filter, just to make sure there's not a great deal of dust or particulate around to irritate the respiratory system as well.
And that's a really interesting point about how leading to more infections leads to more antibiotics. It's one of those connections that you don't often make as well. So it has such a flow-on effect in that regard. And those plants that you mentioned as well, they're so beautiful, but also those ones are fairly easy to grow indoors. I know mother-in-law's tongue, it's you can grow it from a cutting as well.
It's sturdy. Yes, you can grow it from a cutting. Now, the issue there is, even though that is, you're absolutely right, it is the roots and some of the rhizome roots that are actually working to filter the air at night time. So sometimes to have some really good quality soil, it's not just the leaves, it's also the roots in the soil that can be filtering.
There you go. So, yeah, that'll take a long time to establish that from a cutting anyway. Yeah. Okay.
And I forgot to mention, of course, fragranced candles and fragranced personal care products and all those sorts of things, air fresheners that we can be, heavily marketed. But certainly we want to keep those synthetic fragrances out of our air in our home, in our bedroom. We can just use, again, fresh cut flowers, plants, or if we really want to, some essential oils in an oil burner. Or some sort of essential oil diffuser can replace all of those synthetic fragrances. Some of those act as endocrine disrupting chemicals, just to really get back to basics.
That's something that I think so many people wouldn't have considered. Most people know about plastic water bottles, but not so much about candles. And that's such an easy thing to get rid of and swap out.
Yeah, there are some really wonderful companies doing things like soy candles or beeswax candles with rather than synthetic fragrance, just using essential oil to fragrance the room as a treat. But yes, it wouldn't be unusual for me to see someone in clinic with a thyroid disorder who has habitually had very strong smelling perfumes that they've sprayed on themselves, or that has habitually burned synthetic candles in the bedroom as they've been sleeping. These endocrine disrupting fragrance chemicals, they're really quite disruptive at very, very small amounts. If those small amounts we're exposed to over a long period of time, they can really wreak havoc.
Yes, it really adds up. Okay. Are there any other top hazards in the home that you would be wanting to warn people about?
I think the first thing that comes to mind are our cleaning products. The first thing that comes to mind, these can be such an easy swap out. Even as a child, I remember, my mum bleaching the bathroom from time to time and all of us getting a bit of a headache, that evening or that afternoon. There can be some really harsh cleaning chemicals that aren't just respiratory irritants, but that are also nervous system irritants and potentially carcinogenic. So really getting back to basics with the sorts of ingredients that we're using to clean in the home. Certainly I mentioned dampness and mold before. I think these are often overlooked as real stressors, real environmental stressors on the body, not just on the respiratory system, but also the nervous system. When we think about things like chronic inflammatory response syndrome, to have access to a really good building biologist to come and do an assessment on the home, they'll always check for dampness, mold. They'll look at cleaning products, sometimes take shavings of the paint off windowsills to check for lead in paint, and they'll also usually use a Gauss meter and all sorts of fantastic sounding gadgets to test for EMF and radio frequency in the home. So it's not being a naturopath and herbalist with a very big environmental interest. Actually, EMF is not my area of chemical expertise like it is for the wonderful Nicole Bilsma and her team of building biologists. But I don't think we should underestimate the impact of EMF on particularly spermatozoa health, but on the production of melatonin for both partners and on hormonal health all around.
It's such an interesting topic, and I think that the knowledge around that is going to definitely grow. Can you talk about the safety measures put in place in Australia with chemicals, and are there any?
Yes, of course, there are some safety measures. Perhaps I can speak most to pesticides, for example. More broadly, I can share that our safety measures when it comes to chemicals are not informed by the precautionary principle, as are a great deal of chemical laws in other countries, so particularly the countries of the EU who introduced the REACH legislation, which was really informed by the precautionary principle, which means that our laws are not informed by the precautionary principle, which means that it's up to bodies other than the manufacturers to prove safety, and that leaves this really enormous gap between, there's no responsibility on the manufacturers of particular products to prove the safety of their product, not just for human health, but also for wildlife health. Whereas, particularly when it comes to pesticides, I know that we have the AVPMA that governs the laws on pesticide use, and the AVPMA funding is predominantly by the pesticide industry. So there are all sorts of pesticides that we are still using in Australia, things like chlorpyrifos. We add on our fruits and vegetables and nuts like macadamia. Chlorpyrifos has been banned in the EU for over a decade, but it's still used here. Despite the fact that there's data linking chlorpyrifos to neurodevelopmental behavioural disorders, we still use it here because we don't have that absolute proof that it causes harm. We just have very, very suggestive correlative data. We also still use pesticides and insecticides like paraquat that have been banned in the EU for over a decade. Paraquat is extremely toxic, even in just tiny amounts, and has been linked really heavily in the published data to things like Parkinson's disease. But the data, according to the AVPMA, whilst some of these chemicals have been under review for years and years, the AVPMA doesn't feel that the data is strong enough for us to be able to pull it off our shelves.
That's really scary when you consider, I know it's correlative, maybe it's not 100%, but that's pretty scary.
Yeah, well, we could talk about the precautionary principle as the look before you leap principle, really. If you even have some data suggesting that it's dangerous, we should think twice about having it freely available. So I agree with you entirely, and we are a wonderful and lucky country in so many regards. Just being able to turn the tap on and have clean, treated water come out of that, we should have a great deal of gratitude for that. But at the same time, we really are very behind a huge proportion of the world when it comes to chemical control and chemical safety. With the burden of decision making is often put on the person who brings the food into the home. And when I think about new mums with young babies at home who are already very overwhelmed and underslept and sometimes undernourished, for these women to feel that they have to almost do their own research and earn themselves a bit of a pseudo-chemical degree just by reading all of the labels and trying to understand which ones are going to be safe and able to be brought into the home, it does feel very unfair.
For sure. And I think that's often when a lot of women or a lot of families do start to become aware of that sort of information because, they've got a new baby, they want to do everything that they can for it, and then that information gets shared around that, and then it's this ever-opening world of information about these chemicals and how much it actually affects. That actually leads me on to my next question for you, which was, what was your aha moment? So when you started on your journey of increasing awareness about chemicals?
Look, I'd say it was absolutely parenting. So I was a young mum, and I think I had Jazzy around about the time I was 27, and obviously it was a huge learning curve for me, but I think the fact that I breastfed her for such a while, till she was maybe 16 or 17 months, it's very hard not to think about it when you're nourishing a baby from your own body. It's very hard not to think about what else could she be getting or he be getting. So I started I'd already done some postgraduate studies in environmental medicine to sort of awaken me to this world, but I really started to feel a very big sense of responsibility when I was a new mum, a breastfeeding mum. Obviously, it had been on my radar pre-conception and throughout the pregnancy. There are things that we don't eat whilst we're pregnant, etc. But really having a babe in arms for me before I was even 30 just really made me question what I was using to clean the home, what candles or incense I might have been using, what deodorant I was using. I remember not using deodorant because of the aluminium ingredient and quite often the fragrances. So this really probably being a mum kicked me off on my journey to better understanding not just how I could reduce exposures, but also how I could maximise mine and my child's resilience, because there's no doubt about it. It is our babes, it is our little ones that have the highest vulnerability to all of these chemicals. Not only are their detox enzymes very immature and their little organs themselves tiny and immature, our little neonates' kidneys are smaller than a 50-cent piece. But in addition to that, developmentally, they're at such, a critically vulnerable windows because their organs are developing, and some of those organs develop sequentially. So if there's an error early on, it's very hard to recover from.
Yeah, that's certainly a bit of a scary point as well. And one of the points that you raise in your book as well is that the safety data that we do have is not relevant to kids or to babies because of all of those different things that you just said about their different detox pathways and they're actually just quite small as well. So their dose is going to be very different.
That's exactly right. So yes, a lot of the rules and regulations, there's always a window of error that's allowed, but a lot of the safety study and toxicology research and data that we have is based on adult rats, not pregnant rats, not baby rats, but adults with fully formed organs and fully formed systems. And most of the toxicology data that we have is also chemical by chemical, and we don't really understand very well this cocktail effect. And, for example, glyphosate is often referred to in the body of literature as the gateway toxin. So if we have exposures to glyphosate multiple times daily, effectively this body burden of glyphosate makes us more vulnerable to other chemicals. It compromises our detoxification of other chemicals we might be exposed to at the same time, like heavy metals and endocrine disrupting chemicals. So we really don't understand very well, or it's just literally too complicated for conventional toxicology to understand the additive and synergistic effects.
And so that's where the precautionary principle, as you were talking about earlier, would be so good if we could have that here in Australia.
Yeah, if it informed our policies more, we'd be in a much better position.
I do understand the difficulty of the whole thing for our politicians and the powers that be, and the fact that, they do have to come up with a solution, but sometimes you just think maybe they just need a little bit more sort of education about these types of things.
Look, and it really is a conundrum, and we've got ourselves into this mess, and it's not an us versus them thing. There's often quite a push from consumers to want really good looking produce and to have access to produce like apples and tomatoes all year round, whereas if we just flashed back 100 years, it just didn't used to be the case. So we're all busy, we all enjoy convenience, but the inconvenience of convenience, to steal someone else's term, is just that we often overlook the impact of packaging chemicals and particular inflammatory seed oils that have been used to cook or to that have been involved in the production of snack foods and things like that. We really, probably, the more aligned we are with nature around us, the more in sync we are with the seasons and with, having a good idea of where our own food has come from, and the stronger we are in the kitchen. And we don't have to be really gourmet chefs in the kitchen, but just to know how to prepare a couple of meals and a couple of batch cooks, and to be able to store them well, even to freeze them, as opposed to getting takeout or ordering. It does feel very nourishing, doesn't it, to grow your own lemons or your own rosemary or parsley, just to get a little bit back into the sync of how things used to be, and to live simply often can go a very, very long way.
For sure. And those are some really easy things to grow yourself too. So even if you're not like a super green thumb, you can grow a couple of bits yourself and reduce how much you're being exposed to.
Absolutely.
Okay. So can I ask you, what is your take-home message for people?
Well, I guess we're all at different places on the journey of reducing our chemical load, really. So I wouldn't ever want any of my work, whether it be One Bite at a Time, co-authored with Sarah, or my ebook called Be Your Own Solution, or the e-course that I've launched, the I Quit Chemicals, with fabulous pharmacist and herbalist Danielle Shirley, we would never want any of that work to shame anyone. My take-home message is be curious, ask questions, and see if there's just one little thing you can do each day to reduce your body burden of environmental chemicals, whether it be switching over your plastic Tupperware to steel lunchboxes for the kids, or steel drink bottles, or glass Pyrex dishes, whether it be purchasing a particular type of produce that you eat a lot of, organic, deciding to prioritise some of your organic dollar onto apples or spinach or broccoli or any of those things from the Dirty Dozen list. It might be swapping over from normal conventional tea bags or coffee beans to certified organic ones. But one little thing each day that you can do to reduce some of your body burden. You know that whole expression, how do you eat an elephant? Just one bite at a time. Break it up and make it easy for yourself, but just know that you're making decisions each day to push you in that direction of reducing your body burden and maximising your resilience.
I love it. And that makes it so much more achievable for people too. Thank you. Okay.
Pleasure.
So where can people go to learn more about this topic?
Well, like I mentioned, there is that e-course, I Quit Chemicals, which we launch 3 or 4 times a year. That's a 10-module e-course. Each module is about an hour and a half, and we go through each of the different rooms in the house, and we talk about protecting fertility, and we talk about protecting men's health and the next generation. Certainly that's a really comprehensive way to understand this topic better, and iquitchemicals.net is the website for that. But probably the easiest thing, in addition to the book One Bite at a Time, which people can purchase from my website awakenyourhealth.com.au, I also launched more recently the Be Your Own Solution ebook, which is downloadable for $22 from my website, and it is a summary and an extension of the solutions chapter of my book. And being in PDF ebook version, it's a really wonderful thing to download and have on your iPad for a flight, or to be able to refer back to, and to be able to spotlight search particular topics as well. So hopefully that's helpful. I'm in private practice in Woollahra 3 days a week, face-to-face, and I'm also in private practice via Zoom and Skype on Tuesdays and Wednesdays. But I encourage people to ask questions and to seek out the help of building biologists and their primary healthcare provider on topics such as this. And I'm here to help as a backup.
That's so wonderful. Thank you. And I will put links for all of that in the show notes as well, in the blog.
Fantastic. Well, it's been so nice speaking with you, Alison.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for sharing all your wonderful wisdom. So I hope you have a lovely week.
Yeah, thanks so much. Really nice to connect with you, and I love what you do with your podcast. So keep up the wonderful work.
Thank you. Okay, well, bye everyone. Have a lovely, lovely day.